and welcome back for another Throwback Thursday. I'm your host, Sarah Westbrook, and I'm really excited today to talk about cognitive and confirmation bias. I actually made a mistake. As I was preparing for the show, my producer asked me, what are we going to talk about? And I meant to text him confirmation bias. And instead I sent him cognitive bias, which made me chuckle at myself because it's a really common mistake for people to make. So our intent today is to help y'all understand the difference between cognitive and confirmation bias, and then to identify when you are struggling with it, when it's, everybody does it. And so we want to kind of identify when it isn't working for you. So let's get started right away. Alex, if you can pull up our cognitive bias definition, that's the longer one. There it is. So cognitive bias is the system of our brain, and it does this is true for everybody, and that is that as information comes in, we interpret that information based on our lived experiences. So this definition reads, cognitive bias is a systematic thought process caused by the tendency of the human brain to simplify information processing through a filter of personal experience and preferences. The filtering process is a coping mechanism that enables the brain to prioritize and process large amounts of information quickly. And I pulled that off of the techtarget.com website because I felt like that was the best explanation in less than a couple of sentences for our show today. So thank you, TechTarget, for that information. Our brain is processing literally millions of pieces of data a second. Our brains are amazing organs in our body, and our brain also has a tendency to want to know fact immediately. It wants to be able to gain the information that comes in, and it wants to be able to understand it as quickly as possible so that it doesn't have to put in a lot of effort thinking about something and figuring something out. So we all have cognitive bias because we can't understand pieces of information without having a lived experience. One of the areas that we see this kind of coming up in politics and in religion and within our world today is things like with racism, for example. I, Sarah Westbrook, cannot understand the lived experience of a Black woman or a Black male because I am not Black. And so as I interpret racism and what that means for my Black brothers and sisters here in this world, I'm limited in that experiential expertise. This is one of the reasons why Mason and I do the Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma with our examples coming from Mormonism. It's because that is our experiential expertise. And so our experiences within Mormonism are going to be very similar to others who have experienced that Mormon lens on a consistent basis. That doesn't mean that the way I process information is always going to have a Mormon lens on it, but my Mormon lens absolutely strongly influences how I understand differing pieces of data. So for example, one of the things that I felt from the time I was very young, that my role as a woman was to be a stay-at-home mom. And so for a long time, I experienced cognitive bias when I would hear of a close family member or friend that had decided, that was female, that decided to work outside of the home. I would have had some cognitive bias judgments in the sense of what's going on. That's not the best place for her to be. And so you can see on this that cognitive bias can influence really rash or negative judgments because our experiential opportunities are going to always be somewhat limited just because we can't experience everything in this world. But it's also a really good thing. This demonstrates why people who have more lived experiences generally are more nuanced in the way that they think or interpret or judge certain pieces of data. This is why there's the quote that travel is deadly to prejudice is because as you experience and see different cultures and ethnicities and you see how they work and interface with the world, we become less prejudiced because we've gained more understanding. Cognitive bias is our brains, as this says, a coping mechanism in order for us to take on all of that data that's constantly coming in and still survive. We get really overstimulated when we have so much information come in that our brain isn't able to process it, and we might see some what we would call then sensory overload. And I'm going to kind of stop that definition of cognitive bias right there for now, because I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of how that then influences, sensory processing diseases and whatnot. And that's definitely not my area of expertise. And so I want to be cautious there, but I do want to reiterate that every single person on the planet has cognitive bias. It is how you interpret and interface with the world. It's neither good nor bad. It just is. And as we understand that we are taking in and understanding information based on our experiences and perceptions, it gives us better opportunities to challenge our perception when we recognize that there might be a misunderstanding or that maybe we don't have enough experience to understand the data that's coming in for us. So that's cognitive bias. So what about confirmation bias? So Alex, if you can go ahead and pull that one up. Confirmation bias, which is what I wanted to spend most of today on, is the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs or theories. Now, confirmation bias, again, not necessarily a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing, but it absolutely gets in the way of our ability to learn new information or evaluate and analyze data that is coming in. I got a hair on my lip. I feel goofy. Sorry. Okay, I'm back. So confirmation bias means that I would say something along the lines of, children who grow up in homes with working mothers are not as well adjusted, emotionally speaking, because their mom wasn't home with them. That would be an example of confirmation bias. And confirmation bias, we all experience this. It is we really see it, especially when, in our Unpacking Mormonism podcast, where I see a lot of confirmation biases, where the members of the Mormon church are refusing to look at legitimate evidence that demonstrates that their belief systems are based on something other than they think they are based on. So, for example, when I first left the church and Mason was still in, Mason refused to give any credit at all to some of the troubling history surrounding Joseph Smith. His mother recently came out to visit, and she absolutely was refusing to look at any evidence that Joseph Smith may have had sexual relationships with the many women that he married in polygamous, polyamorous, and then marrying and having relationships with minor children. She absolutely wouldn't even look at it, despite the fact that the evidence appears to be coming from a very credible source. And that's that confirmation bias of, because I was taught in Mormonism that anything published about Joseph Smith that's not church approved material is anti, I'm going to have confirmation bias in the sense that I will not look at other pieces of information, because if it's not published by the church, it's most likely wrong. That would be a confirmation bias. We see a lot of confirmation bias in people who struggle with conspiracy theories, or they believe in these extreme things, or maybe aliens and whatnot. And I'm not here to say that aliens don't exist. If I said aliens don't exist, I would have confirmation bias. I would need to look at the evidence before I made a conclusion as to how I actually believe about that thing. So my social media guy, Michael, found this fun little meme, and I had no idea. My producer had to explain to me this is the alien guy. That's probably why I'm talking about aliens here on this. And this is a great meme for demonstrating confirmation bias. And that is everything I find that agrees with what I think reminds me of how right I am. One of the challenges with confirmation bias is that it's a thought stopping technique. And the reason it exists is because our brain is not a huge fan of change. It takes concerted effort for the brain to acknowledge that maybe it's misinterpreting data. It takes the brain a great deal of effort to accept new ideas, new belief systems, new perceptions. And so it's very common for us to say, I don't trust the government. So any information I get, no matter what source it is, I'm going to consistently find that my government is not trustworthy. Hey, that's a red flag that maybe your confirmation bias is getting in the way of you being able to make rational choices or decisions or have your voice heard in a meaningful way. Now, I'm here to say that in a lot of ways, I live in the United States. In a lot of ways, I don't trust the United States government. I just don't, because I've got a lot of experience in that area. But I also have a lot of experience in areas where I can trust the United States government. And that's, that's a well-balanced thing. And so really what we're looking for is how can we balance out our opinions, our choices, our decisions, our perceptions based on the data that is available to us. It's not an easy thing to do. So again, I'll use my example of trusting the government. When I was very young, I used to think that if we called Child Protective Services, that the case would go 100% in the best interest of the child always, because that's what that agency is there to do. And obviously, I was very naive. I didn't learn about my naivety until I had cognitive bias kick in. And my cognitive bias, I had experience being a foster parent in, not King County, it was Pierce County, Washington. So Washington State, Pierce County, my husband and I were foster parents. And we got to experience firsthand how that system consistently failed the best interest of the child, or at least what we felt was in the best interest of the child. And that best interest wasn't that we would get to keep the child forever. Rather, it was about, why are we returning children to abusive homes when they're thriving someplace else? And so with our friends and our colleagues and people that we fostered with, we had new experiential data to demonstrate, hey, we don't have as much trust in this system. Now, having said that, my family has also I think we've got 2 or 3 times where, due to things that just happened, Child Protective Services had to come in and do an investigation on us, on our family. And of course, that was incredibly nerve-wracking. And so we talked to our kiddos and we were like, look, just answer the questions. Just be honest. We'll all be fine. And gratefully, our experience on being investigated ended up being very positive. And in one case, all 3 times it came back unfounded. There was nothing going on in our home that needed to be addressed or have our kiddos removed or anything like that. It's just it's one of the perks of raising special needs children who do and say weird things in public. But on one of those occasions, our caseworker gave us an amazing resource. She referred us to an amazing resource to help parents who had children with schizophrenia. And so that was a vital resource. And so in those areas, again, I went from my experiential, so cognitive bias, my experience of being really young and thinking that they were just perfect and they would always make the best decision, to watching it as the role of a foster parent and being just disgusted with them. And then to my role of being an investigated person within that system and having that come out in a way that I felt was very positive, changed my experiential expertise. Now, if I'm struggling with not cognitive, confirmation bias, I would have said something along the lines of, they investigated me, they should never have done that, they're a horrible agency. And I would have just continued to believe that they're the worst people on the face of the earth, despite the evidence that, hey, the system isn't as broken as I think it is, because I had new data. And so those are just some examples of where confirmation bias fills in how we perceive the world. I'm sorry, I said that wrong again. Blah, blah. It shouldn't start with C's, seriously. Con and con. So here we go. Cognitive bias is what shapes the way I see the world. It's how I interface with it. It's how I interpret what comes in, and it's what my brain uses to make decisions that I feel most comfortable with. Confirmation bias is maintaining a specific set of beliefs in something despite receiving new evidence that my belief system may not be aligned with factual information. And by fact, I don't mean perceived fact or believed fact. I mean fact such as the grass appears green to most human beings, the sky appears blue to most human beings, that type of objective fact, not subjective fact. So Alex, if we have any questions, I'm ready to answer those, if we've got any. So we've got, Pilot says, how do you balance using anecdotal experiences or recognizing healthy information processing to avoid, say, making the same mistakes with social relationships versus these biases? So one of the things, Pilot, that I feel is really important for us as we begin to understand how these systems in our brain work is to learn how to slow down. We really have to kind of separate ourselves emotionally from the experience. And that's very, very difficult to do. And then as we separate the way we feel about something and we look at the data and we challenge it with reality-based questions. And so I like, a good resource would be to look up Socratic questioning. Socratic questioning is a technique I use here in my clinic to help poke holes in somebody's reality when it doesn't seem to be based in objective reality. I will use these questions to kind of challenge the way that the brain thinks in order for that individual to get better at analyzing the data and shifting the way that they behave because of it. When it comes to working with other people, the challenge is that, so for example, my mother-in-law is not in a place where she has any desire to look at Joseph Smith differently than the way that he has been painted in the true believing Mormon lens. Mormons almost worship Joseph Smith, and they would get really mad at me saying, hey, they worship Joseph Smith. But it took being on the outside to recognize just how true that is. But they look at him as almost infallible. They look at him, and the only reason, like when I was little, he was infallible. Now he's almost infallible because some of this data that we have coming in that makes us kind of question his character a little bit is becoming more well-known. Thank you, internet. But because my mother-in-law is not in the brain space where she has any desire to challenge her currently held beliefs, the more I push at her to do that, the more she's going to dig in her heels and resist. And I know that a lot of times we hear that as being the backfire effect, but that's true for anybody. If I have somebody coming at me trying to force me to change, my amygdala is going to push back against that because change is scary. Change opens me up to threats. And I don't want to be threatened, and therefore I put up my defense mechanisms and I'm not open to heal. So Alex, go ahead and put that next question up as I finish this thought. So one of the things that's going to happen in that defense mechanism, if I recognize in myself, hey, somebody's presenting data to me that's new and I'm getting protective and defensive, I might need to take a little bit of a break and walk away and calm myself down and come back to it when I'm ready to do so without that intense emotional reaction, so that I can analyze that information differently. So great question, Pilot. Thank you so much. Amanda asks, as a person who firmly believes that all people belong and have a God-given right to love, inclusion, and appreciation, how can I best respond when occasionally confronted with folks who are buying into a more narrow vision? You know, Amanda, I absolutely love that. And I'm going to answer that with something that Brene Brown taught. And I don't remember which presentation it was that she taught it in. I think it was in her Power of Vulnerability presentation, which is available on Audible. It's like a little pink square with a little white bird on it, if memory is serving me correctly, but you can't miss it. It's on, you can get it through Amazon, Audible, and it's called The Power of Vulnerability by Brene Brown. I'm pretty certain that's where this is from, but she talked about an experience that she had where she learned from her counselor and then later from her own experience that most people are always striving to do the best that they can. And that if I look at people who I feel might have a more narrow vision, you know, even if I keep picking on my mother-in-law, who I love dearly, please don't take this as I'm judging my mother-in-law, not at all, just using it as an example. I absolutely adore my mother-in-law, even though sometimes these conversations are hard and drive me crazy and cause steam to come out my ears, and I need to take some deep breaths because of that more narrow vision. I have to recognize that she is doing the best she can, and that she is doing what she feels is right and righteous, and that she's not in a space yet to face the fear of what if she is wrong. And that's okay. It is not my job to do that. I accept that everybody walks their own journey, and that they're all doing, for the most part, the best that they know how to do with the skills that they have. I think what gets frustrating is sometimes people's best really seems to fall short of what we hope or expect of them. And that can be very challenging for us. So I don't have any more questions. It has been an absolute pleasure being here today with all of you. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, call to action. You're very welcome, Amanda. Call to action is please visit us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. We are on all three platforms under Daisy Girl Communications. We would love to see you. We are also unpacking Mormonism and other religious trauma and raising crazy, growing up to show up. But if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. The email is daisygirlcommunications@gmail.com. Absolutely love hearing from our viewers and listeners. Till next time. Bye-bye.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.